You ever have a moment in life where everything shifts? Like, 1 second, you think you know exactly where you stand, and then the next, the ground is completely gone beneath you? I used to believe that home was the one place where nothing could surprise me, where things made sense, where people were exactly who they said they were. But I was wrong. So wrong. Because nothing prepares you for the day someone looks at you and doesn't see you anymore. They see someone else. And in that split second, when their eyes meet yours, you feel it. Something is off. Something is deeply wrong. At first, you tell yourself it's nothing. A misunderstanding. A trick of the mind. You shake it off, convince yourself you imagined it. But then it happens again. And again. And suddenly, you can't ignore it anymore. I remember the exact moment it hit me. That sick, sinking feeling in my stomach. The way my breath caught in my throat. The way my body tensed, like some invisible force had wrapped around me and wouldn't let go. Because in that moment, I knew. I knew that my father, the man who raised me, the man I trusted more than anything, wasn't looking at me. Not really. He was looking at someone else. Someone from his past. Someone he missed. Someone he wanted. And what happened next? Let's just say I still can't make sense of it. Stick around. Because this story will change the way you look at the people closest to you. If you think you can handle it, keep watching. I never expected to move back home after college. But life has a way of pulling you backward when you least expect it. It wasn't like I had a grand plan or some dream job waiting for me. I was just stuck, trying to figure things out. And home, despite everything, felt like the only option. At first, it was comforting, walking through the front door, seeing the familiar walls, the old pictures on the mantel, the scent of my mother's perfume lingering in the air. But something was different. Something was off. The house was full, my mother, my father, my younger brother, but it felt empty. You know that feeling? When you're surrounded by people, yet somehow, you've never felt more alone. That was home for me. My mother was always rushing. She worked long hours, came home exhausted, barely had time to sit down before she was off doing something else, laundry, dishes, work emails. I'd try to talk to her, but she was always half there, nodding along without really listening. My brother, well, he was 16. He lived in his own world. Video games, headphones glued to his ears, barely looked up when I walked into a room. And my father was the hardest to read. When I was younger, he had this way of making me feel special. Like I was his little girl, his pride and joy. But after I came back, things were different. He was distant, distracted, always lost in thought. He barely spoke at dinner, barely looked up from his phone, barely saw me. At least, that's what I thought. But then, there were these moments. Small, fleeting moments that didn't seem like much at first. The way his eyes would linger on me just a second too long. The way his face would shift, like he was trying to place me, like he was remembering something. And then, one night, it happened. I was in the kitchen, pouring myself a glass of water when he walked in. His hair was messy, his shirt wrinkled like he had just woken up. He rubbed his eyes and muttered, "Hey, honey, did you sleep well?" But he didn't use my name. He said hers. My mother's. I laughed it off. Said something like, "Dad, you okay?" He blinked, shook his head, and chuckled. "Sorry. Long day." And that was it. A slip-up. A simple mistake. But the way he looked at me after, it didn't sit right. I told myself I was imagining things. That it was nothing. But deep down, something had already shifted. That moment in the kitchen? The one where he called me by my mother's name? I told myself it was nothing. A slip of the tongue. A tired mind playing tricks. But sometimes, the smallest things you brush off without thinking, end up being the warning signs you should have paid attention to. I just didn't know that yet. It was a Friday evening when my mother left for her work trip. She kissed my brother on the forehead, gave my father a quick peck on the cheek, and told me to keep an eye on things while she was gone. I watched as she hurried out the door, her suitcase rolling behind her, her phone already pressed to her ear. Always busy. Always in motion. And then, just like that, she was gone. The house felt different without her. Not quieter, not emptier, but something else. Like the air had shifted, like there was this space that suddenly felt too big. Dinner that night was awkward. My brother barely said a word before disappearing back into his room, and my father just sat there, pushing food around his plate, staring at nothing in particular. And then, out of nowhere, he looked up at me and said, "You know, we never watch movies together anymore." It caught me off guard. Movies? That used to be our thing when I was younger. Back when I was still Daddy's little girl. Back when my mother wasn't always working late, and my brother was still too young to lock himself away in his room all day. But it had been years. Still, something in his voice, some mix of nostalgia and something else I couldn't quite place, made me nod. Sure, why not? I expected something simple. A new movie. Something light, something easy. But instead, he pulled out an old box of DVDs, the kind we hadn't touched in years. Home videos. I hesitated. Something about it felt too intimate, too wrapped up in memories that didn't quite belong to me anymore. But before I could say anything, he had already pushed the first disc into the player. And just like that, we were watching the past. The screen flickered to life. There was my mother, young and glowing, laughing at the camera as my father held it, his voice behind the lens telling her how beautiful she looked. I glanced at him, and something in his face had changed. He wasn't just watching. He was remembering. I watched as his expression softened, his lips parting slightly, as if he had forgotten I was even in the room. And then, he looked at me. Not at the screen. Not at the memory of my mother. At me. I shifted uncomfortably, suddenly aware of how eerily quiet the room had become. The only sound was the soft hum of the TV, my mother's laughter echoing from years ago. But my father wasn't laughing. He was just staring. I turned back to the screen, trying to focus on the past, trying to ignore the feeling crawling up my spine. My mother was twirling in a sundress, her hair catching the light, and then the camera turned. Suddenly, the video wasn't on her anymore. It was on me. I must have been 7 or 8. Just a little girl, running barefoot through the grass, my hair bouncing in curls as I spun in circles, giggling. And then, in the video, my mother's voice. She looks just like me when I was her age, doesn't she? The camera zoomed in on me, and for a second, the screen froze on my tiny face, smiling up at the camera, wide-eyed and innocent. I felt my father shift beside me. And that was when I realized his eyes weren't on the screen anymore. They were still on me. My heart started pounding. I wanted to say something. Point it out, make a joke, break the silence, anything. But the words wouldn't come. Because in that moment, sitting there in the dim light of the living room, I felt it. That thing I had been trying to ignore. The thing I had brushed off in the kitchen. The thing I had convinced myself wasn't real. It was real. And it was staring me right in the face. I forced a laugh, standing up abruptly, brushing off my hands like I needed to do something. I forgot I have an early morning tomorrow. I should get to bed. I barely gave him a chance to respond before I turned, walking quickly toward the hallway, my pulse racing. But just as I reached the door, his voice stopped me. "You really do look like her." I froze. I didn't turn around. I didn't say anything. I just walked away. That night, lying in bed, I replayed it over and over again. That look, that feeling, the way his voice had sounded when he said it, soft, almost wistful, almost like, "No." I squeezed my eyes shut, forcing the thought away. It was nothing. It had to be nothing. Didn't it? But then, something happened that I could never unsee. I barely slept that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, my heart still beating too fast, my mind looping through everything that had happened. The movie. The way he looked at me. The way he said it. "You really do look like her." It shouldn't have meant anything. But somehow it did. I told myself I was overthinking. That I was making something out of nothing. He misses Mom, I reasoned. That's all it is. He's lonely. He's reminiscing. It's harmless. But that didn't explain the way my skin had prickled under his gaze. It didn't explain why I had felt the sudden, overwhelming urge to leave that room. And no matter how hard I tried to convince myself otherwise, that feeling, that awful, sinking, gut-wrenching feeling wouldn't leave me. Morning came too soon. I dragged myself out of bed, feeling the weight of the night still clinging to me. My head was heavy, my body slow, like I was moving through something thick and invisible. I just needed coffee. Maybe once I had caffeine in my system, I'd feel normal again. Maybe everything would feel normal again. I stepped into the kitchen, rubbing the sleep from my eyes, and there he was. My father, standing at the counter, pouring himself a cup of coffee, looking just as tired as I felt. For a moment, I thought maybe last night had just been a dream. Maybe I had imagined the way he looked at me. Maybe I had twisted it into something it wasn't. And then, "Hey, honey, did you sleep well?" My stomach dropped. Because he didn't call me by my name. He called me hers. Again. I froze. I stood there, my fingers tightening around the edge of the counter, my breath catching in my throat. I wanted to correct him. I wanted to say something. But I couldn't, because he didn't even notice. He just took a sip of his coffee, staring blankly at the kitchen window, like nothing was wrong. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't just mistaken me for his wife. Again. I swallowed hard, forcing my voice to sound casual. "Did you just call me Mom?" He blinked as if waking up from a fog. "What?" "You called me Mom," I repeated, my voice a little firmer this time. His forehead creased, and for a second, there was something unreadable in his eyes, something I couldn't quite place. And then, just like before, he brushed it off. "Oh, I must still be half asleep," he said with a small chuckle. "You know how it is, brain playing tricks on you first thing in the morning." But I wasn't laughing. Because this wasn't just a slip-up anymore. I sat down at the table, my mind racing. I watched him as he stirred his coffee, as he scrolled through his phone, as he went about his morning like everything was perfectly normal. But it wasn't. It wasn't normal at all. And suddenly, I felt like I was seeing him for the first time. Every little thing I had ignored, every small moment I had brushed aside, every time I had convinced myself it was nothing, it was all adding up now. The way he barely acknowledged me when I first moved back home. The way he started noticing me again once Mom left for the weekend. The way his eyes lingered, like he was seeing something he shouldn't be seeing. The home videos. The way he looked at the screen. The way he looked at me. And now this. Saying her name. Not once. Not twice. But twice in a row. I wanted to believe it was innocent. I needed to believe it was innocent. But deep down, I already knew. Something was wrong. Very, very wrong. I wanted to forget about it. I really, really did. I wanted to believe it was just a mistake, a slip of the tongue, an exhausted mind, nothing more. But once you notice something, you can't unnotice it. And once that seed of doubt is planted, it starts to grow. The next few days felt off. At first, I couldn't quite put my finger on it. My father wasn't acting strange, not exactly. He wasn't doing anything obvious. But that was the problem. It was in the little things. The way he would glance at me across the dinner table, then quickly look away. The way he started asking me questions about my life, my plans, what I wanted to do next, things he hadn't asked in years. And then there were the compliments. Not the normal ones. Not the parent kind. These were different. "You've really grown up, huh?" he said one evening, watching me from across the room, his voice low, thoughtful. "You remind me so much of your mother when she was your age." My stomach tightened. It was innocent. The words themselves were innocent. But something about the way he said it. Something about the way his eyes lingered just a little too long. It made my skin crawl. And then, that night, everything shifted. I had been in my room for hours, trying to distract myself with my phone, my laptop, anything to drown out the thoughts swirling in my head. It was late, almost midnight, when I finally decided to go downstairs for a glass of water. I didn't expect him to still be awake. But as I walked past the living room, I stopped in my tracks. Because there he was, sitting on the couch, hunched over something in his lap. At first, I couldn't tell what it was. And then I saw it. An old, worn-out photo album. One I hadn't seen in years. One filled with pictures of my parents before they were parents. Something about the way he was looking at it made my chest tighten. His fingers traced over a photograph, his brows furrowed, his lips slightly parted. He looked lost. Like he was searching for something in those pictures. Like he was trying to remember. I took a slow step forward, my voice barely above a whisper. "Dad?" His head snapped up. And for a moment, he just stared at me. Like he wasn't sure who I was. Like he wasn't sure if I was standing in front of him, or if I was just another picture in that book. I swallowed hard, forcing a shaky laugh. "What are you doing?" He blinked. Shook his head, like he was snapping out of something. "Just looking through old memories," he said, his voice quiet, distant. I nodded, hesitating. And then, before I could stop myself, my eyes flickered down to the page he had opened. And my stomach dropped. It was a picture of my mother. Not just any picture. A young picture. She must have been around my age. Her hair was pulled back in a loose ponytail, her smile wide and effortless. She was standing outside, the sunlight hitting her just right, making her look almost unreal. And then I noticed his hand. The way his fingers were resting on her face, barely touching the page. Like he was trying to feel her. Like he was trying to bring her back. A chill ran down my spine. I needed to leave. I needed to get out of that room. But then, he looked at me. And in his eyes, for just a second, I saw something that made my blood run cold. Confusion. Uncertainty. Like he couldn't quite separate the past from the present. Like he wasn't sure if he was looking at a photograph of my mother. Or at me. I felt sick. I forced a laugh, stepping back toward the doorway. "Well, don't stay up too late," I mumbled, my voice unsteady. He nodded slowly, still staring at me. I turned. I walked away as fast as I could without running. And as I reached the stairs, my heart pounding in my ears, I heard his voice behind me, soft, almost whispering, "You really do look just like her." I barely made it to my room before I slammed the door shut, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. I gripped the doorknob, my fingers trembling. No. This wasn't happening. I pressed my back against the door, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to steady myself. Maybe I was overreacting. Maybe I was reading too much into it. But then I remembered the way he had looked at me. And that was the moment I realized. This wasn't in my head. It was real. That night I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince myself that what had just happened wasn't real. I repeated it over and over in my head, trying to find another way to look at it. A rational way. A way that didn't make my skin crawl. But no matter how hard I tried, I kept coming back to the same sickening truth. He hadn't been looking at me. Not really. He was seeing someone else. Someone from his past. Someone he wanted to remember. And for the first time in my life, I felt like I wasn't safe in my own home. The house was silent. Too silent. It was the kind of silence that made my heartbeat sound too loud, the kind that made every small creak of the walls feel like something lurking in the darkness. I turned on my side, pulling the blanket up to my chin, telling myself it was over. That nothing more would happen. That I could just sleep and forget it all in the morning. And then, knock. Knock. I stopped breathing. It was soft, hesitant, but unmistakable. A knock on my bedroom door. For a moment, I stayed completely still, my pulse hammering in my ears. And then, his voice. Low, almost careful. "Can we talk?" I swallowed, my throat dry, my hands gripping the blanket so tightly my knuckles turned white. I should have said no. I should have pretended to be asleep, ignored him, waited until he walked away. But some twisted part of me, some part that still wanted to believe I was wrong, that this was all just in my head, made me sit up, made me walk toward the door, made me open it. He was standing there. In the dim light of the hallway, he looked different. His face was unreadable, his eyes shadowed, something off in the way he carried himself. Like he had been standing outside my door for longer than I wanted to think about. I hesitated. "Dad?" He let out a small breath, like he had been holding it in. I just want to talk, he said, his voice quiet. Something about the way he said it sent a shiver down my spine. But I stepped back. And I let him in. He walked into the room slowly, his eyes scanning the space like he hadn't been in there in years. He hesitated in the doorway, like he wasn't sure if he should cross the threshold. And then, carefully, he stepped inside. I stayed near the door, my hands still on the knob, every part of me tense. "What's wrong?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. He didn't answer right away. He just looked at me. Really looked at me. And something about the way he did it made my stomach twist. Like he was trying to place me. Like he was seeing two people at once. And then, he took a step closer. Too close. I backed up instinctively, my heart pounding. "Dad?" His hand lifted. Slowly, like he was reaching for something he wasn't sure he should touch. And then, he brushed a strand of hair from my face. A soft, feather-light touch. Like I was something fragile. Something precious. Something else. And then, "You look just like her." My breath caught in my throat. The air in the room thickened, pressing down on me, making it impossible to move, impossible to think. Because in that moment, I knew. I knew that this wasn't about me. I knew that whatever lines had once been there, whatever boundaries had once existed, they were blurring. And I wasn't sure he even realized it. I took a step back. "Dad, I think you should go." He blinked. Like he was waking up. Like he was only just realizing where he was. Who he was with. For a long, terrible second, he just stared at me. And then, slowly, he nodded. Without another word, he turned. Walked to the door. And left. But the feeling he left behind? That didn't go away. And it never would. The moment the door closed behind him, I locked it. My hands were shaking. My whole body was trembling. I pressed my back against the wood, my breath coming in shallow, uneven gasps, my mind spinning. It wasn't real. It couldn't be real. Because if it was, I didn't know what to do. I climbed into bed, pulling the blanket up to my chin like it could somehow protect me from the weight of what had just happened. But I couldn't shake the feeling. His voice. "You look just like her." His touch. The way his fingers had brushed my hair, so gently, so carefully. The way he had looked at me. Like he wasn't seeing me anymore. Like he was seeing her. And the worst part? For just a split second, I wasn't sure if he knew the difference. I didn't sleep that night. I lay there, staring at the ceiling, counting the cracks, listening for every sound in the house. Every creak. Every shift. Every small, almost imperceptible movement. I waited. For what? I didn't know. For him to knock again? For something worse? For the silence to finally swallow me whole? I didn't know. But I didn't sleep. Not a single second. The morning came, pale and gray, filtering through the blinds like it wasn't the same world I had fallen asleep in. Except I hadn't fallen asleep. I had only drifted, my body floating somewhere between exhaustion and terror, never fully resting, never fully awake. But when I heard the sound of footsteps outside my door, my body snapped to attention. Every muscle stiffened. And then nothing. No knock. No words. Just footsteps. And then they were gone. I swallowed, my throat dry, my heart still hammering in my chest. I forced myself to get up, to breathe, to tell myself that I had to face him eventually. But when I walked into the kitchen, he didn't say a word. He was already there, sitting at the table, a mug of coffee in front of him, his face unreadable. For the first time in days, he didn't look at me. Not even once. It was like I wasn't there. Like I had become invisible overnight. The silence in the house was thick, suffocating. Even my brother, usually lost in his own world, seemed to notice. He sat across from our father, headphones resting around his neck instead of on his ears, his eyes flicking between the two of us like he could feel the weight of something unspoken pressing down on the room. But no one said a thing. And I didn't know if I should be relieved or terrified. The hours passed in a haze. I couldn't focus. Couldn't think straight. Every movement felt stiff, forced, like I was just going through the motions of being normal. Like I could pretend nothing had happened if I just acted like I always did. But I could feel it. I could feel the way the house had changed. Like something had been broken in the foundation, something irreversible, something that no one wanted to acknowledge. And then, that evening, the front door swung open. And my mother walked in. She was smiling. Her suitcase rolling behind her, her phone in her hand, already texting, already moving, already busy. Like nothing was wrong. Like the house wasn't filled with ghosts. Like the world hadn't shifted while she was gone. "Hey, guys," she called, shrugging off her coat. "Did you miss me?" No one answered right away. And then, suddenly, my father stood. "Of course," he said, his voice smooth, easy. Like nothing had happened. Like he hadn't stood outside my bedroom door just a few hours ago. Like he hadn't reached out and touched me like he was searching for someone who wasn't there. Like he hadn't made me feel something I couldn't explain. And when he walked toward my mother, when he pressed a kiss to her cheek, when he wrapped his arm around her waist like it was the most natural thing in the world, I felt sick. Because he was acting. I could see it now. I could see how he slipped into his role so effortlessly, how he played the part of a loving husband, how he pretended nothing was wrong. But I knew. I knew. And I was the only one. I tried to push it down. Tried to swallow the weight of it, to bury it deep, to pretend along with him. But I couldn't. Because no matter how much I wanted to erase it, erase him, erase the way he made me feel like I was her, I couldn't forget. I couldn't unlive that moment. And just when I thought I was the only one carrying that secret, a voice behind me, quiet, barely above a whisper. I saw what happened last night. I turned. My brother, standing there, watching me, waiting, my breath caught in my throat. "What?" I whispered, my stomach twisting. His face was pale, his expression serious. "I saw it," he said again, his voice low, firm. "I saw Dad go into your room." And just like that, the air vanished from my lungs. Because I wasn't alone in this. I wasn't crazy. It was real. It did happen. And now I had to decide what to do next. My brother's words echoed in my head long after he walked away. I saw what happened last night. There was no mistaking it. No twisting it into something it wasn't. No pretending anymore. Because now it wasn't just in my head. Someone else had seen it. Someone else had felt it too. And suddenly, the weight of what had happened, the truth of it, was so much heavier than before. Because now, I had to decide what to do with it. I sat in my room for what felt like hours, staring at the wall, my mind replaying everything over and over again. The look in his eyes. The way his fingers brushed my hair. The way his voice had dropped so low, so soft, like he wasn't talking to me at all. "You look just like her." The words curled around my throat, tightening, making it impossible to breathe. Had it been an accident? A mistake? Had he really just been lost in a memory? Or was it something more? The thought made my stomach churn. I didn't want to think it. I didn't want to believe that the man who raised me, the man who had tucked me into bed as a child, who had carried me on his shoulders, who had been my father. I didn't want to believe that he had seen me as anything but his daughter. But the way he looked at me, the way he touched me, the way he whispered those words like they had been meant for someone else. It didn't feel like a mistake. It felt intentional. And that terrified me. I wanted to erase it. I wanted to push it so far down that it never existed, to bury it so deep inside me that even I couldn't find it again. But I couldn't, because every time I tried to forget, every time I tried to tell myself that maybe it wasn't as bad as I thought, I would hear his voice again. And I would feel it again. That moment. That shift. That sickening, undeniable feeling that something had changed between us. And no matter how much I wanted to, I couldn't unlive that moment. I couldn't make it disappear. And then there was my mother. She moved around the house like nothing had happened. Like everything was fine. She laughed in the kitchen, humming to herself as she unpacked groceries. She leaned into my father when he passed her, smiling, brushing her fingers against his arm like she had missed him. And he played along perfectly. Like nothing was wrong. Like nothing had ever happened. I watched them from the doorway, my heart pounding, my hands gripping the frame so tightly my knuckles turned white. Would this destroy her? If she knew what had happened, if she knew what I had felt, would it ruin everything? Or was I the one being paranoid? I didn't know anymore. I didn't trust my own mind, my own memories. Because what if I was imagining things? What if I had misread the moment? What if I had let fear warp something innocent into something else? But then I remembered. I remembered the look in his eyes. I remembered the way he hesitated, the way his fingers lingered, the way his voice dropped into something too soft, too careful. And I remembered my brother's voice, firm, certain. I saw what happened last night. So no, I wasn't imagining it. I wasn't paranoid. It was real. And now I had to decide if I was strong enough to do something about it. So now I have to ask you, what would you do if you were in my shoes? Would you pretend it never happened? Would you swallow it down? Lock it away, convince yourself that maybe, just maybe, you misunderstood? That maybe it was just a slip of the mind? That maybe it was all harmless? Or would you tell someone? Would you look your mother in the eye, knowing that the truth might shatter her world? Would you sit across from your father at the dinner table, knowing you could never see him the same way again? Would you let it eat at you, let it take root inside you, let it twist into something you could never escape? Because that's where I am now, caught in the middle, between what I know happened and what I wish had never happened, between what I want to believe and what I can't ignore anymore. And the scariest part? The part that keeps me up at night? I don't know if this is the end of the story, or just the beginning. So tell me, what would you do? Let me know in the comments below. And if you want more real-life stories that will leave you questioning everything, hit that subscribe button. Because trust me, you won't want to miss what's next. Some memories fade. Some moments blur at the edges over time, softened by distance, washed away by years that stretch between then and now. But some things never leave you. They stay, like a shadow at the corner of your vision, like a weight in your chest that never quite lifts, like a secret carved into your bones, one that no one else can see, but you feel it. Every single day. Because no matter how hard you try, no matter how much you want to erase it, some moments, you can never unlive. And some things, you wish you never saw at all. But you did. And now you have to live with it.